Hello and welcome to the show. Now the Koenigsegg One is a truly remarkable hypercar. Not only does it have over 1,300 horsepower, just over 1,000 torque, a ludicrous top speed, it is amazingly controllable with it. It actually isn't too hard to extract huge amounts of performance out of this vehicle. It does have a weakness though, and that is the fuel consumption. Of course, you know, all hypercars and supercars are bad. The thing with the 1.1, when I very first drove this car, I tried to do 2 laps of the Nürburgring. I ran out of fuel halfway around the second one. In the hypercar showdown, in a test race, it ran out of fuel around Hockenheim here in 10 minutes. That is less than ideal. However, it did give me an idea for a challenge. We were going to set up a 20-minute race and see who could get their Koenigsegg the furthest. It's not about keeping the car going necessarily for the full 20 minutes, but to get the car furthest. Now, if you fly off at the front at full speed, yes, you will make up lots and lots of ground, but you will run out of fuel very quickly. Whereas if you crawl around at the back, saving fuel, yeah, maybe you'll get to the end of the 20 minutes, but you might not have covered as much distance as the guys at the front. So this was all about tactics and balancing your speed for making progress and your fuel consumption. So we set off with a large group of these vehicles. Already you can see the varying tactics going on, and someone had some trouble across a curb. The curbs are vicious here at Hockenheim. You can already see the group immediately starting to splinter up, as some of the vehicles at the front wanted to fly off with a little bit more speed, while some of us, I was one of the cars that opted to go for this slightly slower strategy. Now, no one was quite silly enough to go absolutely flat out. As I said at the start, these things burn through fuel like just about nothing else. So yeah, there was still some elements of fuel saving, I say relatively short shifting going on from these cars up here. But yeah, they were carrying quite a lot of speed, and their hope was that they could get far enough ahead. You see a lot of them in relatively high gears, you know, coming out of the hairpin and so on, but they were still going for it a lot more. And as you see the camera shot will pan around here, you can still see, I think, possibly, not quite, some of us coming around the corner. I think we might have not quite been that far back at this stage yet, but you get the idea. Now, I was going for the save as much fuel as I could early on strategy here, and I wasn't alone in this one, but there were varying degrees of this strategy playing out with some cars. But you can see how quickly we all spread. We all spread out here. We kind of found little groups to run around in, while then being spread out in the larger groups. I was having to, despite basically I was in 7th or 6th and 7th gear pretty much the entire way round here. Still being in that could cause some issues for the vehicle. The real trick with all of this was to not get caught up in racing. It's an obvious thing to say now, but it's really easy when you're there and there's a car alongside you to think, oh, you know, you just kind of want to keep ahead of them potentially. And yeah, you've got to basically run your own race at this one. Even if there are cars around you, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be losing time if there are cars around you, but you've just got to be running your own race. Now, some of the cars that shot off at the front kind of started panicking, really, when they saw the rate at which the fuel was going down. It goes down at a stupendous level, and while some of them were happy to just keep going and try and make the distance, others decided to go into mega fuel saving mode. So this black 1.1, when it saw spotted an opportunity to get out of the way, the blue car moved across and would now go into, you know, mega conservation mode. The danger with this strategy is, while yes, you've made up good ground early on, you have burnt a lot of the fuel, and now you're falling back. It's yeah, it's a tough strategy call. You might make it further into the race, but it was all about whether you would actually be making the distance. Now, that was all going on right at the very front of the field. There was kind of a mid-pack group of cars that were running around at a quicker pace. They weren't quite going as crazy fast as the real front-running vehicles. And even within this group, there were different strategies, you know, different places. Some cars were burning fuel in one section of the track and then coasting for a lot longer. Some were trying to save fuel in different ways, maybe running really, really high gears, like out of the hairpin. You see the black car here that's falling or plummeting through this group. That was the one I showed in the previous clip, one of the early leaders that panicked when he realised just how much fuel was being burnt and was now trying to save as much as he could. Now we're going too wide through through these next corners. I mean, it's not the most spectacular of races imaginable with these cars, but I mean, they're still having a race of sorts, as the grey 1-1 will want to get this position as they sweep through what would normally be one of the scarier, faster corners on the track. At this stage, the purple car's managed to get himself in trouble, but at this stage, at the speeds that most cars were driving at, it wasn't, you know, particularly a challenge. Now, at the front, we had a couple of cars that were really going for it in terms of speed. You can see they pretty much had the track to themselves, and while yes, they were trying to do an amount of fuel saving, it wasn't anything near like the rest of us were doing. Their plan still being make as much distance as they could while they still had the fuel. The issue is, of course, the car is burning a lot of it when trying to take even, you know, these speeds. They're not the ultimate performance of the car. It's still going through quite a lot of it. I was still content further back to be cruising around relatively leisurely with my 1-1. We were having kind of a little, I say a kind of a little battle. You really wanted to be the second car in these group, of course, because you could go and sit in the slipstream when you came to a straight, and that was great for fuel consumption. The thing is, if you were, like, for example, at this stage, I'm the lead car, I really want to be behind in this scenario. However, if I slow down to try and fall into line behind the car, he might try and stick behind me. We both end up slowing down. We get to a speed where no one is gaining anything through slipstream, and then we're going really slowly and losing a lot of distance to the leaders. So like I said earlier, you really got to kind of run your own race. If there is a car to slipstream off, that's great. If you can find a car to stay behind and slipstream off, then perfect. And a couple of times the silver car did get ahead of me, and I'd follow him for a little bit, and then he'd sort of drop back behind me and so on. We kind of shared the load a little bit. Some slight teamwork going on. Yeah, if you could, that was great, but you had to really not go out of your way if you had a strategy in mind. There were some more extreme fuel-saving measures having to go on with some of the lead cars. As I mentioned, firing your car quickly around the opening couple of laps was a very good way to burn through large amounts of your fuel, and in doing so, if you were going to make it further into the race, you were going to have to coast about and cruise about for a little while, this white vehicle being one of those cars that was now frantically trying to save fuel from having, you know, gone through a huge amount in the opening sections. And as I said, you know, plenty of different ways of doing it by the looks. I think the white car's staying in very, very high gears. Out of these corners, often, as I said, I don't think I really went below 6th gear at any point. The purple and black car, they're going flying past in better position with fuel, or just trying a slightly different strategy at this stage. Now, the leader was catching up to the back of the slow cars. In fact, you can see me and we're technically last place at this stage in the background here, as he was now starting to lap some vehicles. Now, he'd made up some, you know, some great ground, managing to lap us, but it had taken him quite a bit longer than I was sort of expecting. While we were going, you know, quite a lot slower around these laps, it had taken him fair amount of time to catch up to this, and sure, he'll blast past us, no problem. And you know, we were doing our very best to keep out of the way of any cars on different strategies. Problem was, he had gone through so much fuel in getting to this stage. Yeah, he had a huge lead over the field, but we were only about 13-14 minutes into the race when the orange car conked out. It was done. It had run out of fuel, and yes, had built up a very, very large, or a relatively large lead over the field, having lapped probably half of the cars, but he was out of fuel, and there was a lot of time still left to go. So the strategy of going relatively quick and staying consistently quick early on wouldn't really pay off. You just burnt through the fuel too quickly, and while yes, you managed to lap some cars, you couldn't make up enough distance before running out of fuel. And another vehicle would also fall foul of this one. The blue Koenigsegg had been up in 2nd place for quite a long time. We're talking distance-wise early on, but again, used up too much fuel early on, tried to stay running too quickly, and he too would run out of fuel just half a lap later than the orange car. And while yes, they were still technically technically leading the race at this stage. It wouldn't be long before all of their hard work would be undone. Simply being stuck stationary for the remaining 6-7 minutes was, yeah, not good. Amazingly though, only 2 cars would conk out, as the rest of the field were still going, and there were some slight on-track overtakes sort of going on. These two were running a little bit faster. They'd been in the mid-pack, been setting relatively quick pace, although plenty of sort of lifting and coasting was going on. The black car wanting to find a way past, goes for the inside at the hairpin, but both of them are in very high gears. Black car does accelerate a bit better, then decides to coast for a lot longer. The white car will sweep back round and take the position. You know, for my normal sort of kind of racing videos, yes, it is rather mundane, overtaking and so on, that was going on, but you couldn't afford to get caught up in battles. Even then, there were a little bit going on. It was starting to get a bit silly at the back of the field. I was still sticking with the same fuel conservation strategy that I had from the get-go, as was one of the silver 1-1s that had been with me the entire time. We were starting, though, to join up with other vehicles. Often these were the cars that had set off at the front relatively quickly, panicked, and then had to really massively slow down. And they had now joined us, and now there was a lot of very, very expensive Koenigsegg's all in the same group. And again, we were all wanting to be at least behind a car, so we could sit in the slipstream as we come around the hairpin. And this was, yeah, a little bit on the dangerous side, with so many cars all faffing about in the same area that someone trying to make it 3 wide. Not a good idea to try and make it 3 wide, but you know, I'm not wanting to change gears here. You don't want to be sort of pressured by the other cars around you. Now, we were being caught by, again, some of the leaders that were going to catch up to this group, and they were going to sort of be ready to lap us, although they weren't actually too keen on getting past. They were kind of quite happy to sit behind us. They were going to sort of got a huge distance over us. They were happy to kind of sit behind and just slipstream a little bit around here. Now they've got sort of 7, 8 1-1s going into the same corner. Inevitably, someone was going to get into trouble. I think it was a little bit of lag, might have spat someone sideways. They do get going again, no harm massively done there, but this many cars in the same place was not the safest of ideas, and this is by far the slowest race you will ever have with some of the fastest cars in the world, but we were all busy trying to save fuel. We're trying to save as much fuel as we could at this stage of the race. Like, despite having, you know, being in a really high gear, not particularly being that aggressive with the throttle, still bouncing the car across the curb was not a good idea. Now, the silver car with the anime livery that drove past, that was the leader that had now lapped us. The time was starting to tick down, though, and we were getting to the stage where those of us that had saved fuel massively early on, I mean, I'd been running at about 6% fuel a lap, which is a huge saving over what the car does at full-on performance. We were now starting to get to the stage with kind of 5 minutes left where we had enough fuel to now go flat out until the end. We were starting to gradually build the pace up, which is sort of keeping an eye on the fuel burn, what we were going to end up doing, making sure that we had enough to go for the end. But there came a point where all of us that had been massive on the fuel saving were now going to go for it. The leader directly ahead of me here as we go through the hairpin, well, he had used up a lot of fuel staying that distance ahead, or gaining that distance ahead of the pack. He was now going to have to slow down. He can't keep that momentum up for the entirety of the race, whereas now I and a few of the other cars around me were good to go right until the end. This purple car was up in second place and was trying to keep up with the leader, but again, it was all going to come down to who had done the best job of saving the fuel. It was getting fascinating at this stage. All of the different tactical elements, admittedly, is a little bit difficult to follow with kind of lap-down cars that were now going quickly mixed in with lead cars that were going so a little bit on the tougher end to follow. This silver car that was now cutting through the field, that was a lap-down car that was trying to make up for some for a, you know, being far way back, as was the black vehicle, I believe, and. Yeah, kind of all of the strategies were now coming to a head. The purple car, though, having to try and save fuel, just doesn't have enough to really mount a challenge on the leader at this particular stage in the race. I was now going as fast as the 1-1 could. it had got to the stage where I was good on fuel. I had a little panic when, with the time remaining. I just, for sort of about 30 seconds, I went back into conservation mode, and then it was flat out until the end. And of this kind of slow group, of the group that had gotten fuel conservation early, I had been the first to really go full throttle. I've been the bravest on the, well, I can make it from here, and was making my way up through the Odyssey. The white car there had been one of the quicker cars earlier on that had started burning fuel too quickly and had to drop back, so I was making progress through the field. Another car that was making progress as well, this black and white car, had been not quite at the front, had saved a little bit more fuel early on as we were coming towards the end of the race. He was able to push the car slightly harder. The white Koenigsegg that he'd been battling with earlier was a little bit further back. He would go flying past the purple car that was now starting to struggle. It was now having to go very, very slowly in an attempt to save fuel, but it was all about whether the black car would have time to catch the leader. You may have just seen him in the distance as we rounded the hairpin. The leader did still have a fair margin at this stage of the race. There was some quite extreme fuel saving going on towards the very end of this one. As I said, it was amazing how many cars would make it the full 20 minutes, but some of the vehicles that had gone faster earlier on were really pushing their luck. This particular car, amazingly, he got it down to 4% a lap with, well, as you can hear, a lot of coasting. Basically, a small blip on the throttle, get the car at speed, and coast all the way down to turn 1, for example. A hell of a lot of coasting was going on in an attempt to save fuel. However, our victor would be the silver car here. He got to the lead relatively well. When the two cars conked out of fuel, sort of 3/4 of the way through the race, he would inherit the lead. Had done a good job of building up enough of the gap. The black car in second was flying towards him towards the end of the race, but simply didn't have time to catch up to the back of the leader. As we're coming right towards the very end of the 20 minutes, he's pretty much coasting. I don't know if it was out of fuel at this stage. I don't know whether this is just rolling through these final quarters or whether he was just saving whatever he could because he knew the race was about to finish. Either way, he had made it to the end of the 20 minutes, having covered the most distance. I would end up in, I think it's around 6th place. I was catching the silver car I mentioned. I was catching that incredibly fast because, of course, I'm going flat out and he's coasting at 4% fuel a lap, but I didn't have time to catch him. So as far as strategy goes, well, running the car very quickly at the start was not a good idea. They ran out of fuel just too fast. While, yes, you could lap a large amount of the field, you conked out with far too long left, and the field would quickly sort of regain that distance. Equally, saving a lot of fuel at the start, we lost too much ground. We were too far back to gain it all at the end. My strategy had hinged on the cars that had shot up at the start burning too much fuel, and they didn't. They did a very, very good job of going relatively quickly and making distance without going through too much of their fuel. While, yes, I was catching massively quickly towards the end, I ran out of time. Didn't have enough time to make the most of the fuel that I had. So the best strategy was to go kind of medium fast for the opening parts of the race, and then just gradually slow it down, just so that you kept going. Running out of fuel was pretty much, you know, race over. You weren't going to be able to get far enough and be okay to stop out on track, so you had to just keep bringing it back to keep the car going and keep saving that fuel to get through to the end. It was a fascinating race. It was like, I'd hoped this would be an interesting way of doing things, and it turned out even better than I was kind of expecting it to be. It was really interesting with all of the strategies. A little hard to follow. I did the best I could in trying to keep up with everything. Yeah, with sort of different cars on different strategies and lapping each other. It does get quite messy, but yeah, it was really, really good fun. Really good, proper tactical racing going on. So yeah, I highly recommend, actually, that that you give it a go, because there's all sorts of different strategies. Maybe a slightly tweaked strategy would work better. It's just a fascinating, slightly different driving challenge while still making the event exciting, because you don't just want cars trying to go as far as possible, because everyone's just trundling around incredibly slowly. By having a set time and trying to go as far as possible and so on, made for a really strategic race. I really did quite enjoy it. However, that is going to be it for this video, guys. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.